Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Baker Institute and to Rice University. The United States-Israel relationship is one of the closest bilateral relationships that the United States has in the world. During my time in Israel, I was privileged to work with the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, as our guest speaker was. Rabin was a true statesman and became a personal friend. He spoke wisely and persuasively when he described major geopolitical trends in the Middle East. One was certainly the quest for Arab-Israeli peace, and the other was the evolving and complex situation in the Middle East as a whole. Today, Israel cannot but be a very concerned observer of the dynamics of change in its neighborhood and the perception of Israel's growing isolation. It is difficult to try to predict what scenarios will play out in the Middle East. And any person who's foolish enough to predict events in the Middle East, I'd like them to raise their hand. Major challenges abound. The Palestinian bid for statehood in the United Nations this week, the implications of the Arab awakening, with particular reference to recent events in Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, Israel's relations with major regional powers, such as Turkey, and the very dynamics of the United States-Israeli relationship itself. Our distinguished speaker is eminently qualified to address these and other important subjects. He is both a strategist and a practitioner of public policy. In 2009, he was appointed as director of the Institute for Policy and Strategy and chairman of the well-known annual Herzliya conference series on the balance of Israel's national security. This has become a very authoritative forum in Israel. As you can see in your program, and I won't repeat the details of his illustrious career, he served in the Israeli military, in the IDF, for more than 3 decades. He spent most of his service in the intelligence corps. He achieved the rank of Major General in 1991 and served as coordinator of government activities in the territories, a very tough job, until retiring from the IDF in 1995. In addition, our speaker has played a very important role in Israel's negotiations with the Palestinians. We were together at Madrid, and you were a member of the Israeli delegation. And in that respect, I'll be very interested to know what you think of the possibilities of a Madrid II conference in the current circumstances. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome to the Baker Institute and to Rice University Major General Danny Rothschild.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Usually, when I was in charge on the territories, when people ask me how I sleep at night, I said, like a baby, I wake up every hour and scream. So, I want to say a few words on the situation in the broader Middle East. And I will say afterwards a few words on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but not like quite a few analysts in the world and most of the journalists which are covering the Middle East, which believe that if only we'll solve the Israeli-Palestinian issue, then the whole Middle East will be heaven on earth and all the problems are going to be solved. I'm afraid that's not the situation. And when one looks at the Middle East today, the broader Middle East, I believe they, among other criteria, there are 3 main issues which I would like to mention, which characterize the situation in the broader Middle East. One is the rising political power of radicalism in the Middle East. That's along with Iranian hegemonic, ambitious, and we see more and more Islamic movements which are gaining power all over the Middle East. Now that has a lot to do with a poor socio-economic situation in the Middle Eastern country, combined with the demographic situation which doesn't enable to recover the poor socio-economic situation. Why is the poor socio-economic situation so important? Because that's the best fertilizer for growth of Islamic radicalism. That's the ground on which Islamic movements are gaining their power. And in order to give you some insight, I'd like to tell you about a meeting that I had a few years ago with a guy by the name of Sheikh Abdelaziz Rantisi. You probably heard about him. I don't know how many of you heard about him. He was the number 2 of the Hamas, of the Islamic movement in the Palestinians. And there were a few things he said worth listening to. The first thing he told me, we, the Islamic movement, we will never accept the fact that a non-Islamic movement or entity is sitting on Islamic land or occupying Islamic land, meaning Israel. But we have time. We can wait. We can wait 500 years. We can wait 900 years. Our immediate enemy is the PLO. We want to be recognized by the world as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. And he said, no secular leader in the Middle East has the right to rule Islamic people. They have to be ruled by Islamic leadership and to obey the Islamic law. And I said, okay, let's say that you are right. How are you going to achieve it? He then drew me, the pyramid structure of the society, in which at the top of the pyramid you have the decision maker, down to the bottom till you reach the white base of the pyramid, the mass, the people. And he said, we are not a gun-type revolution. We are not going to shoot at the top of the pyramid in order to replace it. Instead, we are going to recruit the support of the white base of the pyramid, and in a democratic way, we are going to push upwards until we replace the top of the pyramid. Now I want to give you an example. What do they mean when they speak about a democratic way? And I commanded our forces in Lebanon in 1983-84. Hezbollah, everyone knows about it today, was a small fraction which was sitting in the northern part of the Bekaa Valley in the Baalbek area in Lebanon. We knew about it. We knew that it's extreme. We knew that Iran is backing it, financing it, training it, and so on. But we were not bothered with that, because on our area, on our border, another Shiite organization by the name of Amal, headed by a guy named Nabi Berri, today is the Speaker of the Parliament in Lebanon, and they were much more moderate than Hezbollah. And suddenly we saw Hezbollah people crawling to the south. No weapons. And they did two things. They bought agricultural farms, and I remember, as if it was yesterday, they paid 6-7 times more for each, and they bought medical clinics and pharmacies in the poor villages of the southern part of Lebanon. And they started to provide the people with food and jobs in the farms, free medical care, free medicines, and within 1 year, Amal was not existent in the south, only Hezbollah. Then they brought the weapons, the rest is history. Because every citizen, regardless whether he lives, expects his government to provide 100% of the services to 100% of the people. If that government fails to do it, either because lack of money or because of corruption, or in the case of the Palestinian Authority, it's both, then someone else provides it to the people, with one major difference. Since they are not in power, nobody expects them to provide 100% of the services to 100% of the people. They have the privilege to look from the outside and in one place to provide milk powder for babies, in another place blankets in the winter to the refugees, and in a third place to build an orphanage home. But then to cash it politically in the election time from everybody, because they are the ones which are providing the goodies to the people. And that's how they work all over the Middle East. And combining that with demography, which is very problematic in some of the places. Egypt, for instance, is a country in which every 9 months you have additional 1 million people to feed. And then to provide them with education, with social services, with health services, eventually with job, with housing. You have to be an economic superpower just to keep the situation as is. And all of us know that Egypt is not an economic superpower. Now, those great guys which made a revolution in Egypt using social networks, using Facebook and Twitter, and all the other means that they could have recruited to theirs, in their case, they knew how to make the revolution. But they don't know what to do with it now because they're not organized. Now it's time for restructuring their movement politically. And as some of us know, once you are dealing with politics, you need organization, you need structure, you need hierarchy, there are ego problems. The ones which are organized in Egypt are the Muslim Brotherhood. They have something which is similar to a party structure. They have their mosques in which they can indoctrinate, can bring the people. They have the money. They have hierarchy. There's no ego problem, and if there are ego problems, they are solved quietly. And they are the only organ in Egypt which can make some sort of a party and run and win the election. And unfortunately, I don't see the young people which went to Tahrir Square organizing themselves to the degree that they can challenge politically the Islamic Brotherhood. And the same in every and each other Arab country in the region. And the outcome of it is what I was referring to, Islamization and Middle East, which is becoming, as a trend for the next 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, more radical Islamic-wise. The second criteria is how the West is perceived by the traditional clients of the West in the Middle East. Usually in the past 15, 20 years, the traditional secular leaders in the Middle East, including the Saudis, the Gulf countries, and others, had a shoulder that once they were threatened, they could lean on. That was the United States and Europe. Today, or in the last few months, a year or so, their feeling is that in case something will happen, and that something is Iran, they don't have a shoulder to lean on. The United States foreign policy is taking the back seat in the Middle East. Maybe rightly so. It's an American decision. But certainly in the year of election, nobody votes or elects a president in the United States because of foreign policy. He can lose election because of foreign policy, but not to win election. He will probably win the election if he'll be able to deal with creating jobs, with health plan, with economic, with dealing with the economic issues, and that's probably what he will be looking at in the next few months until the election. And that is felt by the traditional friends of the United States in the region, but the same is with Europe. Europe is more and more busy with the euro crisis. Europe is more and more busy with Greece, with Ireland, with Italy, with France, with Portugal, with Spain, and the major big countries in Europe are more and more busy with themselves. And the perception in the friends of the United States, or friends of the West, in the Middle East is that while in the past we could lean on the American or European shoulder, the American foreign policy today, as some of the people in my institute are calling it, is a policy of dump and hope. And that is something which characterizes the situation in the Middle East, because the more the United States and the European countries are taking the back seat, Iran is taking the front seat. Iran, even without reaching the military nuclear capability, is gaining more and more power by being more and more involved with oppositions to secular regimes in the Middle East. Iran 4 years ago took a decision that they are going to export the revolution, regardless whether it's in a Sunnite or a Shiite area. First of all, phase one, let's export the revolution and support the opposition to secular leadership all over the Middle East. Then phase two will convert them to wherever they have to be. And the third criteria is the Israeli-Arab peace process. We have peace with Egypt, we have peace with Jordan. We are we were about to reach peace agreement with the Palestinians. We are now in phase that the peace with Egypt is threatened. Jordan, the internal situation in Jordan is not as stable as it used to be a few months or a year ago, much less stable than that. And we have to rethink and see where are we heading. Yes, the Israeli-Palestinian issue is the most important issue which is on the table of every Israeli leader in the past 30 years. Unfortunately, at the moment, the time is time of political decisions. We have negotiated all the issues between the two parties are on the table, were on the table in the last 20 years. Nothing has emerged as a new issue. All the problems are known, the solutions are known. There is no need for too much of negotiation because everything is on the table. The time is for political decisions. Now, unfortunately, on both sides, the Palestinian side and the Israeli side, the ability to take tough decisions is limited, to say the least. In Israel, for political reason, and it's a democracy, and in the Palestinian side, because of Hamas, which is chasing Abu Mazen and will not let him take tough decisions. So the decisions that are being able to be taken are on the lowest common denominator. You have to be a very, very strong leader in order to take tough decisions. If you are not a strong leader, you can take decisions which are the lowest common denominator. And that brought us to the situation that this week we are going to the UN. I don't know what will come out of the UN this week. I think while we are talking here, the two parties are negotiating with the help of the United States, of the quartet. The Russians are involved, everyone is involved in order to try and reach some sort of an agreement which will enable the Palestinians to go down from the high tree that they were pushed to be on. As Abu Mazen said to us a few weeks ago, the Americans gave us a long ladder, asked us, or forced us to climb on the highest tree in the forest, and then took the ladder and went. And we are there, and waiting for someone to help us to go down. And until now, the ladder was not found. And I think they are negotiating some sort of a solution which will enable them to go down, which actually means that the resolution which the General Assembly will take will be a very mild one, which will enable on one hand to Abu Mazen to go back to his constituency and show them, yes, we achieved A, B, or C, and will not endanger the continuation of the peace process, because the peace process has to continue. In the end of the world, in the end of the day, there is nothing which can replace negotiation between us and the Palestinians. And as I said before, it's decision time. It's not negotiating time, it's decision time. Yes, there are a few issues which are going to be put on the table for negotiation, but most of the issues will have to be issues which political decisions will have to be taken, and brave decisions, which are not easy decisions. So to sum up the short opening remarks, there are three issues which are characterizing the Middle East at the moment. And if someone looks and is able to look beyond his nose, few years ahead of us, the situation is very, very problematic in the Middle East. And it's not only problematic to Israel. It's problematic for Europe, and it's problematic for the whole world. And unfortunately, those are the bad news in the Middle East today. And I hope we'll be able to find some way to change that situation, although it's not easy to do so. So thank you.
General Rothschild is ready to take your questions. Good, sir.
Could you give us your assessment of the situation in Turkey with the most recent change of policies there?
Well, Turkey's situation has not changed recently. The Turks, a few years ago, took a decision that they want to go back to be the great Turkish Empire, Ottoman Empire. And it didn't start with a flotilla. It started a few years ago. Few things that Erdogan did which showed us that that's what he meant. And by the way, if you read the book which the Turkish foreign minister published 8 months ago or something like that, he's writing exactly what is the vision of the Ottoman Empire that they want to regain. First thing he did is messing with the army. I think a few years ago, I think it was around 15 to 20 years ago, when I was still in charge on the intelligence, we got the first pieces of information in which the Islamic party Erdogan party, although he wasn't then the head of the party, sent the people to the army to serve in the military in Turkey. Now, as you know, the military in Turkey since Ataturk was the balance between secular and the religion, the Orthodox, the religious part. If 20 years ago they were sent to the army, today there are somewhere around being battalion commander, brigade commanders. That enabled Erdogan to mess with the generals. Generals which underneath them do not feel safe, enabled Erdogan to mess with the generals, and that's what he did in the last 2 years. So that's phase one. Then he didn't went with the flotilla. Before the flotilla, he tackled Shimon Peres in Davos with a famous scene that he did there. And the feeling was that, or is that, what he wants is not necessarily to do with Israel. Israel is an excuse in order to gain support in the Arab world. Mess with Israel, you'll gain support in the Arab world. Then he goes to visit Egypt, and he goes to visit Libya, and he's messing with the Syrian demonstrators. Everything is in line with we, the Turks, deserve to be what we are, the great empire, the great Ottoman Empire. It has to do also with the Kurdish area, with the Kurdish problem that he has in the Turkish part of Kurdistan. As you know, there are 3 enclaves. One is the Turks Kurdish, the Iranian Kurdish, and the Iraqi Kurdish. The major change in the last year or so is that the Iraqi Kurdish became very, very rich, because for the first time the revenues from oil goes to them and not to the central government as it used to be in Saddam Hussein's time. Once they are very rich, they are using their resources in order to build an army, to buy ammunition, to buy weapon systems from all over the world, and they succeeded in what many other leaders in the past failed, meaning to unite to a certain degree in certain time the Kurds from Iran, Turkey, and Iraq together. That is a huge threat on Turkey, and that is something which he is also playing with. Lastly is his venture with Europe. He was not accepted within the European community, although he's a member of NATO. The reason for it is Cyprus, the Turkish side of Cyprus, until it will not be solved. And the big challenge is to come in the next few months. June, Cyprus becomes the president of the EU, takes the presidency of the EU. The Turks already said that if that will happen, they are going to leave, and all the ties with the EU and with NATO has to be seen if they will do or not. But the strategic decision that they took was our face is turning eastwards rather than westwards. And that's a strategic decision that they have taken. And Israel is one point at that game that they are playing all over. It's not only Israel. Yes, ma'am.
Could you, or how do you see the future of Syria?
You have an expert here, which you know. It reminds me about the story of the guy which survived the big flood in San Francisco, and from that moment onwards, he was wandering from village to village and made his living out of telling the story how I survived the flood in San Francisco. His time came and he reaches heaven and the angel meets him at the gate and tells him, listen, we'll welcome you, but you know, here everyone has to contribute and to tell everyone, all the others, what he's doing and how he was doing it. And he said, listen, the only thing I know, and that's how I made my living, was to tell all the story, how I survived the big flood in San Francisco. So the angel told him, it's okay with you to tell it, but bear in mind that Noah is in the audience. So Noah is here, so...
I can hear you anytime. Judy.
Could you explain why there appears to be a strategy of continuing to build settlements in Israel? What does that do for Israel, for its people, you know, your strategy, etc.?
To begin with, it's not a strategy.
It's not a strategy.
It's not a strategy, although one has to be honest, and I know that I haven't answered your question, I'll do it afterwards. Although there are people in Israel which believe that that part of the land belongs to them. And they truly believe in it, and I respect them for what they believe. It's not my belief, but that's what they believe. Having said that, the amount of building in settlements in the last 2 or 3 years has been reduced tremendously. And I'm not talking about the big settlements, which in every negotiation with the Palestinians it was agreed upon that land swaps will take place, but on the other settlements which are not going to be within the land swaps with the Palestinians, in those areas almost reduced to zero the amount of settlements. Now, as long as settlers are there, the Israeli government will have to provide them with security, because wherever there is an Israeli citizen, he will get security in that. And all the other will have to be solved in negotiation. And I guess that in the negotiation, as we did in the past, as we agreed upon in the past, look, the difference between us and the Palestinians about the swap of the land was a difference between, if I remember well, between 4.9% that we wanted and 2.1% that of this area of the West Bank that they were ready to swap. That's where we stopped. I think we can overcome those 2% of land swap in the area. So that's the situation.
You want to answer the question on Syria?
No, I think you want
No,
to.
you said you would take it. That's up to you. That's another question. Yes.
Syria, one word, and I'm sure that Ambassador Jerajan will be able to.
He's not speaking.
No, I'm not speaking.
If you force him, he will. But look, I think the situation in Syria is as such that sooner or later Assad is going to lose his chair. It will take time. It's not like in Egypt or in other places, but it boils from underneath. It spreads all over. But the fact that the opposition is not organized, like in Libya, like in other places, shows that it will take time. It will take more time.
Nobody from the outside is helping them like they helped in Libya. How is this going
to come about if nobody's doing it from the outside? They have no
Well-
arms. This the opposition, unlike Libya, has no arms.
Well, if you see them, some of them have arms. In Syria, almost everyone has some sort of an arm at home. But as you saw in many other places, you don't necessarily need massive arms. The fact that hundreds of thousands of people are going to the streets, and the Syrian army basically is a Sunnite army with Alawite commanders or some Alawite units, is a prescription to some sort of let's phrase it differently. It gives them a chance to succeed. I don't see Assad last for a long time. It might take months, 2 months, 6 months, but eventually I think he's going to lose. I think the ones which know it much better than we do are the Iranians and Hezbollah. And Hezbollah taking their weapons, which they have stored in Syria, because they fear that we are going to attack it in Lebanon, and we are not going to attack it in Syria, taking it out now from Syria back to Lebanon shows you that they know something probably that we don't.
General, would you comment with examples, if you will, please, the conflicts between the Shia and the Sunni groups that we hear about from time to time?
In what sense?
Well, for example, I understand in Iraq, the minority party under Hussein, the brutal, the majority. Iran has a majority. Saudi Arabia has a religious group that is a very prominent, that type of thing. Is there political unrest from that religious difference within the Muslim?
In some places there is a political unrest. In some places it serves only religious unrest. But you have to understand that the whole Middle East is mixture of sects. Iraq, you can eventually, to my mind, Iraq will be divided into 3 sects. You have the Shiite sects in the south, which are very much pro-Iranian or with Iran. You have the Kurdish area in the north, and you have the poor Sunnites area in the middle, in the Baghdad area in the middle. But even in Iran, you have Shiites in Iran, but the whole 30% of the northern part of Iran are Azeri, which are Shiite, Azerian Shiite, which is different from the Iranian Shiite. It's much less extreme than the Iranian Shiite. You have Alawite in Syria, which are much more closer to the Shiite than to the Sunnite, but they are minority in Syria. Most of Syria are Sunnites. In Saudi Arabia, you have most of them are Sunnites, but the big oil production facilities in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia are in the Shiite part, which the Iranians are very much messing over there. So it's all mixed up. We have learned in the past that they know how to live together, and in some places they are fighting each other. So you cannot generalize it. You have to see in every place what are the situation between the sects. It's different from Lebanon. You have Druze, Shiites, Sunnites, and some Christians are still left there, but in every place it's different. You cannot generalize it.
In your earlier remarks, you essentially talked about what's going to be the loss of the sort of democratic uprisings if the more radical Islamists are the only ones who are organized and able to win elections. Do you see any help for this, any solution?
Unfortunately, I don't see a way that they will not take over.
And if they do, will subsequent
And if they do,
legitimate elections happen?
look, those elections are going to be one-time election. The next election are going to be less democratic election. We saw it in Iran, Khomeini's time. We saw it in Hamas, PLO within the Palestinians, and we see it in other places. The elections, the first one are going to be democratic as much as they can be democratic. The next one are not going to be democratic election. Yes.
You talked about the grand strategy of Turkey reestablishing an Ottoman Empire. Iran has a grand strategy of some sort. How is that playing out right now in Syria?
It's not.
Is it a conflict?
There is a conflict, and it's not playing out. And I think one of the biggest problems Turkey has today is with Iran. On the face of it, rapprochement, and there's a honeymoon. On the ground, they are blaming each other that each of them is recruiting his courts to fight the others. The American radar, which was put on Turkish soil a month ago, doesn't help. And on the face of it, you see that there is a struggle underneath the ground between Turkey and Iran. And I think that struggle will be enhanced as time passes because there is conflict of interest between the two countries.
No. The Baker Institute has published a study called the Territorial Endgame, with ideas as to where borders would be if there are two states. And it gives various options, a great deal of detail, lots of maps. And the option that involves the fewest Jews living in what would be the Palestinian state has a little over 100,000 there. The assumption is that they're going to have to move, which is sort of reinforced by the Palestinian statements now that there shouldn't be any Jews in the Palestinian state. If you look at the complexities of moving 8,000 people out of Gaza, which had no particular biblical significance, and you just look at the difference in numbers, 100,000 versus 8,000, plus the fact that the 100,000 are in areas that were part of the biblical homeland, Beitel, Shechem, etc., and so there'd be more resistance on the part of people who live there to move it. The study shows you have to move Ariel with 30,000 people. What do you think are the prospects for a two-state solution when you face those problems of moving over 100,000 people?
Look, to begin with, everything has to be looked upon considering the alternatives. The alternatives to a two-state solution is a one-state, which, as far as Israel is concerned, 99% of the Israelis is a non-starter, because in that case, either we will not be a democratic state or we are not going to be a Jewish state. Now, practically speaking, the work which the Baker Institute has published is a very good one, but it's one of few others which have been done, and those are exactly the issues which are negotiated. I don't see Ariel being moved. Ariel is part of the swaps which was agreed upon between the two parties, so Ariel will stay. Problem is with other small places in the area. And look, once you understand that out of the 100,000 Israelis which you believe, let's say that's the number, I'm not sure that that's the number, I think it's is a lower number than that, but for the sake of argument, let's say that's 100,000 Israelis. How many of them are there because of ideological hard ideological issues that brings them to sit there, and how many of them are there because of convenience. That if you give them an alternative within Israel, they'll live by themselves. I guess that at least 50% of them are there not because of ideology, but because of convenience. Or let's say that their ideology is not so tough to the sense that they will be willing to stay there even if we are not going to be there. And with the others, we'll have to deal with it. It will be our problem. We'll have to deal with it. I don't accept the Palestinian Rhineland theory. That's not acceptable. If people would like to stay there, they will stay there. The same as Arab Muslims are living in Israel. And we'll have to deal with it. It won't be easy, it will be tough, but it's compared to the alternative, which is much worse.
You had one question. I think there's a question on that. Good. You're on.
Notwithstanding that the negotiation between the Israelis and the Palestinians are not getting anywhere, the issue of the right of return, how come Israel has not brought up the right of return of the Jewish community in the Arab countries, where they immigrated to Israel during the 40s and 50s?
The right of return of Jews to Arab countries?
I know they don't want to go back.
Why should they?
Because if you convert that issue into financial compensation,
that's a different story.
yeah, it's a different story. So why doesn't Israel bring that?
To begin with, it was on the table, and it is on the table, but the issue of right of return has not yet been solved. There is a very firm Israeli position that the refugees are not going to be returning to the state of Israel. Their solution will be within the Palestinian state. That's a very firm position that was told to the Palestinians all over the negotiation, from day one until recently. As far as Israel, as Jews which came from the Arab countries, I know that there are more and more talks about asking for compensation. I don't know what will come out of it, but it's on the table. Some people are saying it's a gimmick, some people are saying it's not a gimmick, but it's on the table.
Do you believe the youth protests we saw in Iran will continue, or will the regime be able to suppress them?
Where?
The youth protests we saw in Iran previously?
Iran?
The green protests?
Unfortunately, I'm pessimistic in that sense too. And I said before, when I described the way Islamic movements are working, is that they are using the fact that people expect their government to provide 100% of the services to 100% of the people, and they are taking advantage of the inability of the government to do so. Once they are in power, the first thing that they are doing is establishing a big, strong security apparatus to protect the government. The Iranians did it. They went one step further and they established two apparatus. One was the Basij, the other is the Revolutionary Guard. The only reason for establishing it is to protect the government. Hamas in Gaza, the moment that they took the power in Gaza, they established a strong police. The reasoning which was told to the people was, we are going to fight prostitution and drug dealers. In fact, that police has to protect the government because they understand that from now on, everybody expects them being in power to provide 100% of the services to 100% of the people, and they cannot do it. In Iran, the Basij and the Revolutionary Guard, which, by the way, are looking one after the other, are very cruel. And I think that what happened in Iran in the last time, the last revolution, showed us that they are so cruel and so brutal that there is an opposition, but at the moment they don't dare to go out to the street. And it will take time until they will reorganize to the next round of going to the street, and that takes time.
Yes, General, I've read a number of articles recently that have talked about the level of armaments that is possessed by Hezbollah now, the sophistication of the rockets and the accuracy, and it's not what you had 4 or 5 years ago, and that if there was a conflict, that there could be major damage within the state of Israel. Israel has recently developed a new anti-ballistic missile shield that they are employing right now. My question is, how does this planning figure into Israel's military's response? And I realize you can't give us any secrets or anything, but this aspect that there may be substantial damage in another conflict within Israel itself.
Look, the next war will be different from the wars which we have faced in the past. In the next war, the people in the rear, in the cities, they are going to be the ones which will take most of the heat of the war. Having said that, future wars will very much depend on 2 elements. One is cyber, and the others are missiles. What you can do today with cyber is prevent war and sometimes hit in a non-lethal weapon to the degree that a lethal weapon is hitting the other side. As far as missiles are concerned, yes, it's a huge problem, but I call it the syndrome of the primitive. Weapons which are sophisticated can be dealt with easier than weapons which are primitive. Missiles which have electronics in their warhead are much easier to deal with than missiles which are primitive missiles, like the Qassams, like those which we do not have electronics in their warhead. And I hope that we'll be wise enough to be able to deal with those weapons.
One last question, Murray, since you've been very persistent. Last question.
How do you see the accord, the agreement between Hamas and the PLO? Is it just window dressing, or is something done on the ground to implement that?
No, it's a non-agreement. It's an agreement which Hamas, because of Egyptian pressure, agreed to sign. Agreed to sign, and they took by surprise Abu Mazen, the PLO, and once the Egyptians said, "Listen, Hamas is willing to to sign. How come that you are not?" So he signed. There was a ceremony. There is such a big, huge ideological gap between the two that nothing can come out of it. And we knew it from the beginning, and it's only a window dressing, as you call it, and not more than that. The gap, ideological gap between the two is so big that it cannot be bridged. On tactical issues, yes, but not strategic issues.
Thank you, General.